Hi team. So today I want to talk about binary thinking, this either or approach to things, the right, wrong, for or against mindset that shows up in politics, culture, sport, gender discussions, and even personal relationships. I want to talk about the fact that most things people try to condense into a black or white, true or false idea, whereas most of life ends up happening in the grey areas in between. So in this episode, I want to talk about what binary thinking is, how we get drawn into it, how it can be both useful and incredibly limiting, and most importantly, how we can be more aware of it in order to make conscious decisions about the times that we use it and the times that we don't. With that all being said, let's get into it.
Thinking Differently with Andy Franklin.
So first off, what is binary thinking? Binary thinking is the concept of reducing things down to an either or, true, false decision. We reduce everything down to where we only have two options. Something is either good or bad, or right or wrong. And this simplifies the world. This makes it easier to live in the world. It gives us less cognitive dissonance because we have an idea, we pick a side, and then we move on. It makes it more comfortable because we don't have to live in the grey. But it also erases all of the nuance of any individual situation. And when you get rid of all of those in-betweens, it can be really damaging. And because of binary thinking, we've built lots of systems and structures within our society that puts things into boxes. And as soon as you have two boxes that you can choose from, you get stuck if you're somewhere in the middle. Everybody always says, just pick a side. And interestingly, years ago, I read a book called How to Win Every Argument. And one of the points that it suggested in that book is exactly that, turning everything into a binary decision. Because rather than debating the nuance, rather than getting stuck in the grey, if you can turn the argument into a do you believe this or not, then it gives you a better chance of someone siding with you. And this is also what they suggest when you're debating. When you're talking about a topic, you should pose a yes or no question. Make someone pick a side and then challenge that side that they've picked. Because as soon as you remove the ability for people to speak in nuance and in varied terms, you give yourself a platform that you can then argue against. So this idea of are you with us or against us is an artificial construct that is created in order to be able to fight against something or bring people completely onto your side. And what's really scary is it feels like in politics nowadays, everybody has read that book. Everything has to be in this binary way. You have to completely support one party and completely hate the other one. You have to be completely liberal or completely conservative. And I think the world is getting more Polaroid. And I think the world is getting more polarized because of this. The more we force people into different buckets that move further and further away from each other, the more the grey area is lost and there's no bridge that people can make to meet each other somewhere in the middle. And so I want to work through an example. And the example that I want to work through is gender. Now, this is a risky and emotive topic, but stick with me because I think it really validates the idea that things aren't binary. They are only binary because we make them so. And so for me, the issue with gender is not about which gender people identify as, or whether they can pick any number of different categories. The issue is that we have built a society around the fact that we can only have two genders. So sport, you have to compete as a male or a female. Prisons, you go to a male prison or a female prison. And even bathrooms, where we're seeing a very slight increase in unisex bathrooms. To challenge this idea, most bathrooms are still male or female. And so it's not the identity of the gender that's the issue. It's the social construct that we put around those that forces people into boxes. And as soon as you force somebody into a box, then if someone doesn't sit within that generic box, then we have a problem. We have to put them in one of two categories. And that's where a lot of the debate and the arguments come, because people want to put them in different boxes. And so the other example with gender is sport. There's always something in the media about somebody normally competing in a female event, but their gender is being disputed. And that's because there's lots of things that play into gender. There's lots of things like the sex that you were identified with at birth. But then there's also your testosterone levels and your testosterone intake levels, which are different. You can have a very high testosterone level, but a very low intake level, which means that even though you could be testing very high for testosterone, you don't get a physical advantage over any other female competitor. And yet again, I think the challenge is that we have to put people in a box. And I understand that in sport, the decision has been made that you need to put people in a box of male or female because somebody decided that that was a fair way of splitting people to make sure that people were competing with similar ability levels. There is a genetic advantage for someone who has more testosterone in their body and can use it, in that you have stronger, denser bone structure. You normally have the ability to pack on more muscle, making you stronger. And all of these are completely legitimate things to base a category on. But as soon as we say that it's male or female, that's when we create a binary structure which not everybody fits into. Now, if you wanted to pick a different binary category that you could absolutely identify 100% of the time, then you could probably put people into categories to compete. If you wanted to do it on biological age, if you wanted to do it on only people over 6 foot tall are allowed to compete in this event of high jump, and only people under 6 foot tall are allowed to compete in this event of high jump, in order to make it a more level playing field, then that would absolutely work, because there is an objective measure of how tall people are. But as soon as you have to create nuance around what constitutes as male or female, once there are multiple different factors that go into this, then all of a sudden, the structures that we've created, the boxes that we've created that we have to put people in, become an issue. And this is only in sport if you want to compete in sport. Whether or not somebody has a higher testosterone level and are more able to build muscle doesn't matter if you work in an office and that is not something that a metric needs to be measured against. And so I think what I'm trying to say here is that it's not that people are too complicated. It's that the systems that we're trying to put them into are too simplified for the range of different humans that we have. And again, politics is another one where we're forced into this binary idea. And that creates all kinds of things. That creates the negative voting idea of, I disagree with this person more than I agree with this person, so I'm going to vote for the person that I don't really agree with in order to make sure that the person I disagree with doesn't get into power. And I think this is obviously more epitomized in the US politics than it is in the UK, where we have more parties that we can vote for. But in the US, you have to not only pick who you're going to vote for based on what you agree with, but you have to stack rank all of the things that you care about and decide which one you care about the most. If you care about gun freedom and your ability to carry a weapon, but you also think that women should be given the right to abortion, then you have to somehow marry these two things together and work out which one out of these disparate ideas you care more about in order to put yourself in a single box. And that's ridiculous, because we're all humans and we all have different views on everything. So the idea that we have to force ourselves into this binary category means that everybody ends up disappointed and not getting what they want. We've lost the ability to bridge that gap. We've lost the ability to say, actually, I agree with you on this point, or I see both sides of this argument, I sit somewhere in the middle. Or even something that you never hear politicians say, which is, actually, I don't know the answer right now. I'm still working through all of the different options. Everybody has to throw themselves into a camp and argue vehemently for their thing, because otherwise they fear that they're not going to get respect. And so we've lost the ability to discuss things. We've turned every discussion into a debate. We've turned every discussion into something where you have to be right or wrong. You have to prove your point and disprove other people's. And that's a really dangerous place to be when it comes to bridging a gap and understanding other people's points of view. And so this idea of always being right is driven by the ego. Once you put yourself in a bucket, when you decide between this binary idea, we naturally feel like we have to defend that idea. And it feels a lot more difficult to move to the other side because there's such a big gap. There's a void in the middle. And even in the media, this is frowned upon. If a politician changes their mind, they're called a flip-flopper. They're told that they don't know their own mind. Whereas actually, the idea of being able to take in new information and change your opinion on something should be something that we champion in politicians and other people. It should be something that everybody is striving towards. And the truth is that you don't need to win every argument. You don't need to always be right. And you don't need to always prove your ideas to other people. Sometimes it's okay to have different opinions to other people and accept that they have other opinions to you. Both can be valid based on your life experience and where you're coming at it from. And yet, as soon as you start thinking about right or wrong, then the ego kicks in and it says, but if that person's right, then I must be wrong. And I don't want to be wrong. So I have to prove that person wrong instead. It takes away the ability to say, we can both be right and be okay with that. And as soon as you stop trying to win an argument, that's when you can really listen. When you stop trying to prove yourself right and them wrong, that's when you can really hear their opinions. You can see where other people are coming from, and you can sometimes even integrate their views into your view of the world to give you a more balanced and nuanced idea of the world in general. But that only works if you can listen to them. Now, binary thinking isn't all bad. Sometimes we can use it to our advantage. So we can do things like simplifying very complicated decisions to make it easier to make a decision. The idea of do I want a tea or a coffee is a lot easier to think about than do I want a hot drink, and if so, which one? Sometimes there is a benefit of simplifying things down in order to help us move through to make a decision. And so there's this thing that I've heard a couple of times in podcasts around the shoe salesman. So the idea is that there was this shoe salesman. Someone would walk into his shop and they would say, I would like to see this pair of shoes. And so he would bring the pair of shoes and then they'd say, oh, and I'd like to see that pair of shoes too. And so he'd bring the second pair of shoes. And then they'd say, and I'd like to see that pair of shoes too. At which point he would turn around and say, which ones would you like me to take away? Because what he'd realized is that if you kept bringing more shoes, people would be overwhelmed by the number of decisions and would buy none of them. Whereas if you keep that choice down to a binary choice at all times, they're doing selective choosing. They're doing stack ranking as they go. And so what they're left with is a binary choice of, do I want this pair of shoes or do I want this pair of shoes? And they're much more likely to buy. And so binary decisions can be helpful, but only if we're aware of them and only if we're using them for the best possible means. Okay, so what are the alternatives to binary thinking? So the first one is spectrum thinking. That's the idea that instead of thinking of something as an on or an off, a yes or a no, we see everything on a scale. And we can just move up and down that scale. So we are never fully for or fully against something, but we are just moving further up or down this line. The next is pursuing the idea of nuance and context. I believe this in this specific context, or it depends being a valid answer because it depends based on what the other criteria are. And then there's dialectical thinking, which is the idea to hold two opposing ideas in your head at the same time and believe both of them. Now, this is really difficult. This creates cognitive dissonance, and cognitive dissonance is something that's uncomfortable for us. We don't like it. It makes the world more grey, and grey is uncomfortable. But practicing this skill and getting better at accepting that there is nuance and two things can be true depending on the way that you're looking at it can be massively beneficial. And given that most things in life are subjective based on your opinion and your life experience, and I have a whole other episode on subjectivity that you can check out, then it can also just be really beneficial to keep creating that nuance and avoid falling into that binary trap of I'm right and you're wrong. And then the final one, and I think one of the most important ones, is empathetic listening. Listening to everybody as if they could be right. Listening to where you agree and where your views overlap. Finding common ground with people on subjects that you disagree with them on can lead to a healthier discussion, which in turn can then help all of us move to a place which is more nuanced and balanced. And so how do we actually do this? Well, first I think we have to start with awareness. We have to be aware when we're thinking about something in a binary way, or in conversation where we're challenged by somebody else putting your ideas into a binary true or false. Anytime somebody argumentatively says, so do you believe this, yes or no? You can see that in action. And the best way of dealing with that is challenging the notion that you have to be put in this binary box in the first place. Turning around and saying, I don't agree with the question, is the best way out of that, rather than trying to argue your way out of a box that you've just been put in. The second way is to listen more than you speak. The more you actively listen to other people, the more you can understand and hear their nuance, and the more you can adapt it into your worldview. Next, we have to remove the ego. Anytime you're thinking that your decisions and other people challenging your decisions or your ideas of what is absolutely right or absolutely wrong is a challenge to you personally, then you're always going to try and fight back against that, which automatically switches off your listening ability because you're triggered and you're ready to fight them on those points. You stop being able to be logical and rational about the fact that some of their points may be true. And then finally, I think we all have to get more comfortable with the grey. It's uncomfortable thinking that two things can be true at the same time. It's uncomfortable having cognitive dissonance all of the time around the fact that everybody might be doing the best that they can, even if they are doing things that you don't agree with. But the more we can get comfortable with that, I think the more we can bridge the gap between polarized views and move to a place where everybody is more comfortable with nuance and thinking less in a binary way. And so I think in conclusion, binary thinking is not all bad. It's just very often limiting. And when we're not aware of it, it can be limiting without us being able to see the limits. It can be polarizing and push people further away from each other when, in order to create a better society, we all have to be closer. We all have to understand and really listen to other people's points of view. And the way we do that is by being curious, by dropping the ego, by removing our sense of ourselves in these labels, in these binary ideas and the way that we think about things, and actually just being able to fully be curious and listen to other people and why they feel the way that they do. And if we can all do that, then the world would be great. So that's the end of this episode. I'm really glad that you've listened to it to the end. So thank you for that. By all means, share your opinions in the comments. Some things in the binary world are really emotive and polarizing. So please be kind and considerate if you're going to make any comment. And with that, I'll sign off. So thank you so much for listening. Take care, and I'll speak to you on the next one.